our reefs are pretty good, and our waters are pretty clean, and our fishing practices are not as destructive as they are in other places. And then the most pristine reef in the world, like Palmyra, I think, is considered to be the most pristine reef in the world. But the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, even though there's no people, they're not considered totally pristine because there's a lot of old fishing gear that makes its way there, a lot of trash from other parts of the Pacific that make its way there. There has been fishing in the past, and then of course you have anthropogenic or human-induced changes that are worldwide, like increased water temperatures or increased acidity. So I've already talked about a lot of threats to the reef, but I mentioned bleaching earlier, and when corals get stressed, they lose their algae. So this is just to put some numbers on it. Okay, so if a coral reef experiences a few days to a few weeks of conditions that it does not like, it will undergo bleaching. If those conditions return to normal, the algae can actually be reincorporated into the tissue, and then it's business as usual. Although the coral afterwards is not quite as healthy, it may not have as much of the algae in it, it is still alive and still producing. If those conditions persist for too long, the coral can actually die because it no longer has its dominant food source. I said earlier in the presentation, it's over 90% of their energy comes from the algae, so they really need to have that there. If that happens, if the coral dies, that space is overtaken by turf algae, and then as it breaks down, it's taken over by other things. So after the course of sometimes even as little as 1 year, you can go from a highly productive reef like that on the left to just a rubble, algae-covered rubble environment there on the bottom. And that takes a really long time to recover from. In fact, we don't really know how long it takes to recover from that. But based on coral growth rates and settlement rates and stuff like that, you can probably assume that it's close to decades, if not a century or more. Coral in the past has undergone some mass extinction events. When the asteroid hit the Earth near the Gulf of Mexico about 65 million years ago, the one that supposedly wiped out the dinosaurs, when it hit the ground, it released a lot of sulfur from the crust. And that sulfur turned the whole ocean into a big vat of acid. And every single organism that lived in the ocean that made a calcium skeleton completely dissolved and died out. So you can look at the sediment record, and you'll see all these shells, from however many millions of years ago up to 65 million years ago, and one day they're just gone. Completely gone. There wasn't one left. But over the next few million years, they started showing up again. And then, still today we have a lot of those things. So, if you're concerned about the Earth as a whole in the next few million years, far beyond your lifetime, corals will probably survive us, but the corals are important for us and for our kids and for our health and all that, so we want to make sure that they don't disappear like that. We like to train our volunteers to identify live versus dead coral versus just rock. And so if you look at this picture, particularly the top picture and then the picture on the right, you'll see a cauliflower coral that's partially alive. So here on this side where the surface is clean, one solid color, that's alive. Same thing over here. But this other part that looks like it's covered in really following organisms, algae, crusts, whatever, same over here where the skeleton is sort of worn down, that's an area of dead coral. Over here, this is a coral head that died a long time ago and has been taken over by various other organisms. But one good sign here, this little patch here is a piece of corrugated coral, and that's settled right on top of that and started growing. So that's hope that if we do lose parts of our reef, if conditions become hospitable again, that those areas of reef can be recolonized by coral and then regrown into healthy reefs. When you look, that picture's too far back. If you remember, I showed a picture of a mound coral, which kind of looked like a deflated souffle. There was like a ring of purple with like just bare bare rock on top. That should have been a big dome, but because of feet, it was trampled down, all the polyps died, and then it was worn down through from even more feet, and then the edges are starting to grow up over. But that part on the top isn't rock, it's actually dead coral skeleton that's left over from, that part of the skeleton probably would have been 30, 40 years ago. But like I said, the edges are growing up over, so with decreased contact with the coral animals, they actually do start to look healthy again, and they do start to reclaim that space. Other threats, coastal development, so even here in Puako, with wastewater or with new construction, I see there's some new home sites over here or whatever. Looks like there's some exposed land, some dirt, so some of that stuff can get onto the reef. Sedimentation can be a problem. This is my next slide. You guys don't really have much agriculture here, do you? I know there's like a bee farm, but that doesn't use fertilizers. But in general, agriculture has fertilizers or waste from cows, so we have ranches and coffee farms over a couple of wood. And the nutrients from those activities can get down into the water table and out into the ocean.
Golf course.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you guys have the Puna Beach Prince golf course there. So we actually find at Kahaluu that we're not seeing really heavily increased levels of nutrients, even with all the stuff above us. But there's probably other methods that might tell you otherwise. And then in the future with you guys, as we work together more, we're hoping to come up with some way for you guys to measure if wastewater is getting onto the reef or if fertilizers are getting onto the reef from activities in Oka. Let's see. Remember again, I said with nutrients, corals need low nutrient waters. Otherwise, algae blooms can happen. You can have increased phytoplankton or even increased macroalgae, being the big sort of plant-like, grassy types of algae that both take up space and sunlight. Sedimentation can be a problem. Some areas are prone to sedimentation naturally, like the Waipio to Pololu stretch over on the other side of the island. The top part is Upolo Point, and this is something that you guys can be concerned about with all the deforestation and cattle grazing that has happened Mauka. There's no more water held in the soil. It's not holding the soil down, so you guys have these strong winds coming down between Kohala and Mauna Kea and Waialae. You can have a lot of this dust picked up right off the ground and blown out into the water. Also heavy rains, when they hit the ground, instead of sinking in, the soil is so dry it's actually hydrophobic, so that means it won't absorb the water, it blocks it out. And the loose dust on the top will get picked up by the water, float right on the surface. It's so dry and so fine that it actually won't even get wet. It'll just float right on top of the water, like you can float like a paper clip on a glass of water. And then it just goes right out onto the reef. So that's probably wind causing that on that picture. But rain, Pelicane Bay up here by Spencer Beach Park over beyond Puukola, one storm can put like 9 to 10 tons of sediment into the reef there. So when that happens, the sediment can settle on top of the corals and block sunlight and block oxygen or whatever gas is coming from the water and smother it, and that can result in big areas of the reef being lost. Corals do have the ability to remove particles from on top of them, but they can't do it when it happens too fast. If there's a few particles of sand here and there, they can just slough off some mucus and get rid of it. But if you have a big mat of sediment that settles down on top,